tous des Berbères. Quand on dit Touareg, c'est berbère. On est de la grande famille berbère. Du Niger, du Mali, de la Mauritanie, du Maroc, de l'Algérie, de la Tunisie. Tout ça, il y a des berbères. Nous sommes de la même famille berbère. Touareg, c'est un nom que les Arabes nous ont donné. On a été les berbères qui ont gardé l'origine du nomadisme jusqu'à présent. C'est pendant la rébellion au Mali qu'il y a eu des problèmes et nous sommes partis quitter le pays pour nous réfugier. Le groupe a été formé dans des camps de réfugiés. Il fallait l'union pour faire la force pour qu'on s'en sorte bien. On a essayé tout, mais avec la musique, nous pouvons parler de notre peuple, parler de notre culture et parler de nos problèmes dans le monde entier.
90% of the time when they talk about Berbers, they usually only talk about the very tippity top of Africa. And this is done deliberately. It's done deliberately because they don't want you to find out that there are Berbers going all the way south to the point of Africa. And given how little the ones with pale skin are, it tells you how recent the pale skin entered that region, even though the Berbers, as I have shown in previous videos, were mentioned as early as the 1300s or the 1100s in the Sudan regions. And the fact that they were called the Sudan regions. They were not called the Berber regions. In fact, I remember reading this. At this time, it is devastated as the result of a disturbance that happened there and that we shall mention when we discuss the Mali dynasty in its proper place in the history of the Berbers. Given what the earlier woman in the band said and what this author says, we can easily see that the people who are Berbers come straight from a true African history. But we do not really need to rely on words when we have pictures. For example, this. This is an obvious African from the past. And this is not from South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, or even Mali. It's actually from Algeria, one of the areas which they consider very Berber territory. In fact, they consider it the halfway. One of the reasons why these places are not mentioned is because of complications like these, where people are expected to see people paint themselves in one way, but as you can see with the hair and the general body and the face, there is no giving up on what these people looked like. And even if there was a Middle Eastern component, the trick is to try and delete the sub-Saharan quote unquote component, the black African component. And the way they do this is, again, I'll mention, they only mention the very top of Africa. And even that very top of Africa has black people in there, going back thousands of years. These paintings are from Tassili Najar, and they represent a time when there were rivers fully going through the desert areas. Today, those areas look like places that people just can't live in. But of course, we can see that they were thriving. This also made it so that the Sahara was connected with no real thing to stop you from crossing in a very difficult way. And so they did. And the culture is mixed from north and south. And this happened over and over again hundreds of thousands of years, and so the populations remain as they were. We do not need to look at a whole bunch of these images, and so I want to talk about the Sanhaja, which I mentioned. The Sanhaja was a group of people, but it's more of a confederation. This Sanhaja, that was a confederation, or still is, was dotted all the way from the Western Sahara to the Mali areas. And given this, it means that they had a proper position as people to be able to conquer places as far as Spain. There are individuals in the Sanhaja who became extremely famous in the entire Islamic world. These people would be scholars, warriors, and all kinds of other people. They're not really talked about in history. In fact, if you were to chart down the history of Europe, the places, the time when North Africa conquered Spain and the Iberian areas would be a giant turn in the history of all time, really, because no longer did Europe have this safe place where no one could possibly come in. And even the things that happened afterwards, where Europe spread out from Africa, the first place they went to was the Berber areas. They conquered these lands. They knew that these were the places that they needed first in order to be able to do any real damage around the world. If we look backwards once again, but in a different location, in Chad, what we see is cattle dating back thousands of years. In fact, they date back to the 5th millennium BC. And only later do we start seeing camels in the regions of Chad. Now, would it surprise anybody to know that this is the exact story in the Algiers? At first, we see cattle, a cattle fishing area, and then afterwards, we see camels about 2,000 years later. So 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC, we see cattle, a cattle culture. And then thousands of years later, about the same time, we see camels in Chad. That's when we start seeing camels in the Algiers. Imagining that the close neighbors of the people in Algeria had cattle at the exact same time, but did not get it from the exact same place, is one of the most far-fetched things that anyone could say. I haven't yet heard anyone say it, so I will assume that most people would agree that in Chad, since we see cattle first emerging there, really at about the same time we see it in ancient Egyptian paintings, then there is no dispute that the cattle that comes from Chad is probably the same cattle that is in Algeria. In fact, there's a breed of a type of humped cattle that we find in that region. Now, you remember the Nigerian boat that I showed? Something that proves that boats existed in this West African, North African region in Algeria are paintings of boats. Boats are an important thing because you do not expect to see boats in a deserty area. This is why on and on with cattle, boats, all kinds of evidence tells us that these people were a far spreading people with no thought that their lands were turning into deserts. but living in abundance. But again, from that 4000 BC era with cattle, they change 2000 years later and they start to become a camel culture. What we know about dromedaries or camel is that they come from East Africa. And if you move from East Africa all the way to West Africa, that is a cut through Chad. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in Chad there are camels from about the same time. But if they went from East Africa, traded to Chad, traded to Mali and other places, Algeria, how did they get to North Africa? The simple answer is from East Africa, they can get to Egypt. From Chad, they can get to Tunisia. And from Algeria, they can get to the Morocco areas. In Chad, there is no dispute that the light skinned Arab DNA, which is now found in too many people in that region, came in recently. And if we go and check in West Africa, I feel we will find the same thing. There are populations that existed prior to the Sanhaja and their domination of that region. But in order to get there, we'd have to leave the rock art time and move a little forward. Though the growth of Arabic and other languages, Berber languages, have dominated the regions, it's not lost on historians that the original languages were those closer to Niger languages, like Wolof or Soninke or Pular or Bambara or Sera. All of these languages represent a home to the very original people of that region, with the Berbers moving in and out of that region being nomadic, of course. These people, who some assume were the Bafur, say that these people were hunter gatherers before any of these other groups joined. Now, over the hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, we would have seen some mix, not just in genetics, but a mix in language. Now, I wonder if people are truly exploring that part of it. Though time can get rid of things that are very important, there are some things that just remain. For example, the names of specific people who were Sinhaja. For example, Ibn Arjurum. And you can see that he was a contributor in grammar. Abu Umar Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn al-Asi ibn Ahmad ibn Suleiman ibn Isa ibn Daraj al-Kastali was another Berber, Sinhaja. And like the other ones I'm going to mention, just passing, he was also a poet and scholar. Then there's Ibn al-Arif, who was also one of these famous people. And finally, al-Barusi. Now, what these people all have in common is that they had been to Spain at least once in their life, if not spent their entire life there. And of course, they went in other places in the Islamic age, because of course, the Islamic age was one of expansion. Islamic golden age was one of expansion. We find Negroes in China. We find people who are from China in Africa. We find Indians in Europe. Obviously, I'm talking about explorers, not necessarily large groups of people. Ibn Battuta lists a bunch of explorers during his time, but no one stands out more than Abu Barakat ibn al-Balfilkil. And the reason why he stands out is because one of his key destinations that he wants to explore is the Negro lands. And so he travels from Spain to the Negro lands to Egypt to China to India, and then he writes it down. Now, I do not know where to get his book from, but I do know that it's written that he was told to write down what he said. And think about, because the worst thing is that we lost a lot of books. Think about how many explorers outside of Ibn Battuta, outside of some of the Mali guys, outside of the guy I showed you from Mogadishu, how many we lost that could have highlighted or showed us something more important about this time. This time was not a time of small, insignificant errors. And in fact, I think the highlighting of the Western areas, the Western world, the Renaissance, and looking at the world through a Western lens, you start with, this time is the ancient, this time is the prehistoric, this time is the this time is the that, and it's all based on the history of the West. When we can see that the Islamic Golden Age, really, it's not an Islamic Golden Age, it's a golden age of many cities around the world. It's a golden age of Bantus, it's a golden age of Niger, it's a golden age of Islam, Berbers, some parts of Europe, some parts of Asia, China. So calling it the Islamic Golden Age is a very narrow way of looking at things when so many other civilizations in the world were at their peak, and then coincidentally they all fall at the same time when Europeans arrive on the shores. You know, Japan, peak. Islam, peak. China, peak. Africa, peak. And they continue this upwards trajectory, creating great things, even trading with people. And sadly, somehow that intrusion, that extra European DNA has convinced us that we should shy away from people who come from outside of our nations, which is why I believe that most people, and I'm not saying there is, but most people don't want there to be even a small component of Arabs in the Berber regions. They don't want there to be a small component of anything else because the destruction that was caused, and then the mentality. We have adopted their mentality of playing to race rather than looking at our history for what it is, as something that was bigger than our own countries, something that went far and wide. And that it's actually hilarious because if you saw the woman in the beginning, the Berber, though she was lighter in complexion, clearly mixed with black people, but though she was lighter in complexion, they made no distinction between themselves and the black Berbers. And they really don't do this anywhere in North Africa. The people who tend to make a difference are the Arabs. But we inherit that from them, and we live with anxiety for this. Our Sheikh, Abul Barakti ibn al-Balfiki, told us of many strange things he had seen. Among them was that he claimed to have entered Constantinople and to have seen in its church 12,000 bishops. He subsequently crossed the strait to the Spanish coast and visited the Negrolands. Thereafter the ruler of Fez summoned him and commanded him to commit his travels to writing. how is it relevant to West Africa, the fact that there is multiple people from around the world? Well, it gives us validity because, of course, people like Mansa Musa, who were famed to have lots of money, this is a European source for that. Then you have Ibn Khaldun and the other Egyptian author, who I forgot his name. They both wrote about Mansa Musa and how his predecessor, even though it's difficult to find out what the real name of him is, went to the Americas. And of course, this is boosted up harder if you think about the fact that these were times of exploration, that it wasn't just one person. And in fact, we see right after this map, we see that there are even boats in the Spanish with Spanish like flags traveling around the west of Africa. And we know that this has something to do with trade, not to mention the fact that the Arabs themselves have no reason to pretend that this West African, especially the fact that the guy was a Negro, and I've shown you how some of these writers in the Islamic Golden Age were very, very, very anti-black, but somehow these words, these groups, these people, two of them wrote about how amazing this Mansa Musa was and about the travel possibly to America by his predecessor. Could that be a coincidence? I don't think so. And also, could it have spurred the other people like the Moors to do the same? Especially since we know about Koshkosh, who is another one who is famed to have traveled very far in the westerly direction using the oceans.